It is May 18th at 6:34 p.m. Thank you for being here, everybody. Tonight we have Bill Doherty joining us, Nikki Mendoza, Andrew Freeborg, and Courtney Holgate and Aaron Rivers as community members serving on the Budget Committee. I think we may be joined later on in the evening, potentially by Josh Clark and Penny York, also serving in that role. We also have with us, looking around the table, I'll go this way, Therese Jones, Samia Alabdraba, Vince Adams, Sarah Finger McDonald, and I am Shauna Tomini, serving on the school board. Director Whitebear is excused tonight, as is Director Baker. So tonight we have a meeting of the Budget Committee, which is a really important meeting and a meaningful meeting, and we're just really grateful for you community members who have stepped up to volunteer your time and serving alongside of us in reviewing the budget that's been presented to us by the district and in coming together for that. So as is tradition, we often step back in our role as school board members to nominate a community member to serve, or potentially a community member if one is willing, to serve as the chair of the Budget Committee. And so I'm going to open the floor for nominations for that chair role. Would anyone like to make a nomination?
I would like to make a nomination. I nominate Andrew Freeborg to chair the committee.
Okay, so it has been motioned by Director Finger McDonald to nominate Andrew Freeborg. It's been seconded by Therese Jones. Nope, no seconds? Okay, no seconds needed. Thank you for coaching me along the way. I'm serving as substitute chair tonight. I'm learning as we go. Keep the coaching coming. Do we have any other nominations? Do we need to have discussion? Or do we open to discussion? Okay, so you said ask for nomination 3 times. Do I ask again in terms of one more? Do we have any other nominations? Okay, so then we call for a vote. All right, I saw you do this. Do I hit with the gavel? Yeah. Thank you for letting me learn in community. I appreciate that, and publicly. Hopefully we'll break down some barriers to serving on the school board to say it's okay to come forward and learn openly in public. Thank you. All right, and so does everybody have a chance to vote, including board members and community board members? All right, we'll go around. So first I need to ask for a motion for that nomination. Is that correct, or do I?
Yes, you have to.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I move that we appoint Andrew Freeborg, the chair of the Budget Committee, by acclamation.
Thank you. So we've had a motion by Director Adams, which has been seconded by Director Jones, to nominate Andrew Freeborg as the chair of the Budget Committee. Let's go around and vote. We can do it by proclamation. So do we just need an up or a down? Are there any objections?
No.
No? Hearing none, motion approved. And I will pass the gavel.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Once again, as always, I am honored by the trust that you all have put in me. So at this time, we will open nominations for a Budget Committee Vice Chair.
Madam Chair? Oh, that's called habit. Chair, I nominate Courtney Holgate.
Okay. Would you accept? Yes. All right. Are there any other nominations for Vice Chair? Going once? Going twice? All right, nominations for Vice Chair are now closed, and the Chair would accept a motion.
I move that we name Courtney Holgate Vice Chair of the Budget Committee by proclamation.
I second the motion.
Okay, we have a duly made and seconded motion to appoint Courtney Holgate as Vice Chair by proclamation. If there are no objections.
Her name is Courtney.
Okay. Hearing none, the matter is now closed. Okay, at this point, I would like to invite Superintendent Noss to present his budget message.
Dear Budget Committee members, colleagues, and Corvallis community, I submit for your consideration the proposed budget for the Corvallis School District for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2023 and ending June 30th of 2024. This year has been a complex challenge as we transitioned to what we had perceived to be a relatively normal school year. Today's students are more diverse, their needs are greater, and the world they will enter after graduation is more complex and demanding. Our students continue to have heightened post-pandemic academic and social-emotional needs, and our commitment to serve them remains unchanged. I believe the proposed budget leverages all of our available resources to meet those needs with an attention to equity and inclusion, demonstrating alignment with our goals and the values of our dynamic community. Over the last 2 years, we have been able to maintain and add services for students because of strong fiscal reserves and new state and federal programs like High School Success and Student Investment Account, and elementary and secondary school emergency relief ESSER dollars. We hired more staff to meet the academic and social emotional needs of our students in a time when they needed them most. Unfortunately, our enrollment continues to decline. State resources are not keeping up with the cost of operating our schools, and our students' increased needs remain as the funding to address those needs has dried up. Through the use of our remaining surplus reserves and ESSER 3 funds, the proposed budget for 23-24 will ensure that our new state and federal funds are safely targeted to the latest programs and initiatives, bringing expanded opportunities and educational support to our students rather than supplanting the general fund to continue current service levels. Like most districts in the state, our enrollment is declining. This is a trend that we believe will continue based on recent birth rate statistics combined with high housing costs that often deter young families from settling in Corvallis. As state funding is allocated based on the number of students we serve and the unique needs they have, we will need to closely monitor enrollment over the next few years and make changes as needed to align with our revenue sources. The state legislature is still in session and has not yet finalized the state school fund allocation for the 23-25 biennium. The proposed budget assumes a state school fund appropriation of $9.9 billion, with 49% allocated in the first year of the biennium. This is the allocation recommended by the governor, but it is not adequate to maintain our current service levels as rising costs continue to outpace limited growth in resources. We have and will continue to advocate for funding at $10.3 billion, which is broadly determined to be the actual service level required statewide. Heading into 23-24, we have approximately $2.4 million of ESSER 3 funds remaining. These funds will help us weather the general fund shortfall we anticipate with a $9.9 billion state school fund allocation. However, due to their temporary nature, we know that they are not a long-term solution for our funding concerns. We will need to spend time next year prioritizing and evaluating student needs, knowing there will need to be reductions in the 24-25 budget due to the loss of these one-time funds. This budget proposal includes a total investment of $190.4 million, represented by 5 separate funds, the largest of which is the general fund. The total budget for all funds represents a decrease of 24% compared to the 22-23 budget, which reflects the spending down of bond proceeds in the Capital Projects Fund as we continue to complete capital improvements in alignment with the bond measure approved by Corvallis voters in 2018. The general fund represents 53% of the 23-24 proposed budget for all funds and accounts for most operating activities of the district, except those activities required to be accounted for in other funds. General fund revenue comes from 2 main sources: local property taxes and the state school fund. Budgeted general fund current resources total $89.9 million, an increase of $2.5 million or 2.8% from 22-23. The majority of the increase in general fund resources is due to typical increases in property taxes and increase in state funding per pupil due to statewide enrollment decline. Budgeted general fund current requirements total $90.9 million, an increase of $0.7 million or 0.7 from the 22-23 budget. Salaries and benefits comprise the majority of planned expenses at $71.5 million or 79% of all current requirements. The general fund includes $9.6 million that fund approximately 71 FTE provided by the local option levy, which voters renewed in May of 2022. Because of the local option levy, our students experience smaller class sizes and receive specialized instruction in physical education, music, and art. The local option levy also provides students with more access to counseling and social work services, vocational and technical education programs, and extracurricular athletics and activities. School Board Policy DA provides guidance regarding the financial objectives for managing general fund reserves. Those objectives include establishing a sustainable level of programs, protecting the district from unnecessary borrowing to meet cash flow needs, providing prudent reserves to meet unexpected emergencies, protecting against catastrophic events, and meeting the uncertainties of state and federal funding. As outlined in the policy, all general fund contingency and reserves accounts are budgeted to result in the minimum level required. Assuming underspending of 2%, a projected operating deficit of $0.8 million in the general fund in 23-24 will exhaust all reserves in excess of that policy level. The Special Revenue Fund represents 14% of the 23-24 proposed budget for all funds and accounts for local, state, and federal grants received by the district for specific programs. Earlier this year, the district developed a comprehensive plan to align and integrate separately created state and federal programs focused on educational innovation and improvement. Integrating funds from various program sources, commonly referred to as the blending and braiding of funds, is a strategy that allows the district to leverage multiple strategies and funding sources to implement more cohesive plans that positively impact students. The outcomes and strategies for each program are then combined into a single strategic plan that supports the common goals. Additional details of the district's integrated plan and strategic investments are included in the organizational section of the budget document, and the full plan and budget are available on the district's website. Through multiple U.S. congressional actions, the district received federal grants through the ESSER Fund, which was established to address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on elementary and secondary schools. These resources are budgeted in the Special Revenue Fund and must be spent by September 30th of 2024. The district plans to spend the remaining $2.4 million ESSER 3 funds next year to fund 21 FTE, primarily in the form of teacher leaders at our elementary schools who will focus on implementing and sustaining building-wide systems focused on assessment literacy and positive student behavior. Corvallis voters approved the issuance of $199.9 million in general obligation bonds in May of 2018 to finance capital improvements at all schools. The successful passage of the 2018 bond is helping us make sound investments, solve long-term challenges, and transform an aging infrastructure to offer more innovative and equitable opportunities for all students. Bond proceeds have provided the district with funds to install new safety and security equipment, replace portables with permanent classroom spaces, replace 2 elementary schools, renovate and repair school buildings, and expand educational spaces for career and technical education programs. The Capital Projects Fund represents 10% of the 23-24 proposed budget for all funds and accounts for activities related to the acquisition, construction, and equipping of school facilities. The 23-24 proposed budget for the Capital Project Fund totals $18.1 million and includes funding to complete renovations at Adams Elementary, Mountain View, Franklin K-8, and the Harding Center, where the College Hill High School program operates. This balanced budget represents our best effort to achieve our goal with the resources that are available to us. The development of the proposed budget was informed by our declining enrollment, inadequate state funding, and impending end of one-time federal relief funds, and a shift in students' exhibited needs. These trends will continue to influence the direction of our future budgets and how we will manage our resources in the coming years. In the meantime, we will continue to move forward and meet the challenges of serving our students in these challenging times. We'll continue to advocate for adequate funding for our students, and we will continue to look for ways to innovate and improve. I'm proud to serve at you in the community of Corvallis as I begin my 8th year as superintendent. And I'd like to express my appreciation to our community for their generosity in supporting our schools. We would not be able to provide the level of service and learning to our students without this support. I would also like to thank the members of the Budget Committee for their service, support, thoughtful analysis, dialogue, and consideration of this proposed budget. Respectfully submitted, Ryan Noss, Superintendent.
Thank you, Superintendent Noss. At this point, I would like to invite Finance and Operations Director Olivia Myers-Bunch to present the budget highlights.
So I know sometimes it can be hard, that screen's pretty small, and the really big one is behind us, and so I kind of made some note pages so that you can kind of follow along as we go and make some scratches if you have any questions you want to follow up on or anything like that. Okay. So I'm going to start with a real high-level summary of the 2023-24 proposed budget. So when we look at the total budget for all funds, the total budget amounts to $190,372,312. Our budget is made up of 5 separate and distinct funds. The general fund represents the largest portion of the budget at 54% and $101 million. You could see that the special revenue fund represents 14%, the debt service fund represents 10%, the capital projects fund also represents 10%, and then our internal service fund represents 12%. Over the last couple of years, this chart, this graph has looked a lot different because the Capital Projects Fund represented a really large percentage of our total budget. And as we continue to complete those renovations that Ryan was just talking about, that will eventually go to zero and won't be part of the budget after that. So, in total, the budget represents a decrease of about 24%. That's primarily related to the change in the Capital Projects Fund as we continue to complete our projects. When we look at total resources and total requirements, again, this is that same number because everything has to match, right? So our total resources, $190.4 million. When we look at the different types of sources, we receive funds from local sources, which would be like our property taxes, intermediate sources. State sources would include our state school fund and some very specific targeted state grants. Federal sources are mostly made up of grant funds, and then other sources represent a lot of the funding that goes into our debt service and internal service funds. On the requirement side, same number. It's always good that they match. That means something's right. And when we look at how we spend our dollars, salaries represents the biggest portion at 30%, $56.8 million. And then associated payroll costs, so that's all of the fixed costs tied to our payroll plus the benefits we provide to staff at $33.2 million or 17%. So we know that combined salaries and benefits is making up the largest portion of our budget, as is pretty normal. We spend about 9% of our budget on purchase services, 9.8 million on supplies and materials. Capital outlay, we've talked about, that represents the majority of those bond projects. Other objects would include things like our principal and interest payments on our bonded debt. Transfers is a pretty small number, but we do support our athletic fund, our district athletic fund, from multiple sources, and so we do some transfers to pull from local option funds and the student investment account and other sources. And then other uses of funds really just represents the reserve accounts and unappropriated funds that we carry over from one year to the next in the different funds. So since we spend the majority of our budget on salaries and associated payroll cost, I did want to just provide a little bit more in-depth information about that. So the proposed budget for next year represents a total budget of 90 million combined for associated, or for payroll and associated costs. You'll see there's two different colors in the chart. The bottom green color represents the salary cost. I guess they're both green colors. The top color represents the benefit costs. What's pretty common for governmental entities, but probably not very common outside of that, is that we pay 37% for associated costs attached to salary. So for every dollar of salary that we pay, we also spend 37 cents for that dollar of salary. It's a pretty high rate, but again, not unusual for governmental entities. From compared to the current budget to next year, the spending here looks pretty flat. It's actually decreasing slightly, and that is reflective of some of the changes we've had to make to our budget based on all those things that Ryan was just talking about. So our total budget includes 864 FTE. FTE stands for full-time equivalent. So a full-time position, somebody that works 40 hours a week would be considered a 1.0 FTE. So we have a lot more employees than this number because we do have a lot of part-time employees in the district. But the total budget includes 864 FTE. The change compared to our current year budget is about 43 FTE. And so we have made some planned staffing reductions as part of the proposed budget. When we look at the total staffing budgeted, this is how it breaks down: 48% for licensed staff, 45% for classified staff, 4% for administrators, and 3% for other non-represented staff. So while our spending on salaries and benefits is pretty flat, the reason why so like our spending is flat, but our FTE is going down, and that's just because the cost per FTE is going up. And again, not an unusual concept from one year to the next. We provide salary and benefit increases to our employees every year. And so you can see that compared to the current year budget, what we're proposing for next year is about a 4.9% increase in the cost per FTE. And so on average, when we look at that 864 FTE and that $90 million of planned spending, it works out to just over $104,000 per FTE. So I'm going to pause real quick, see if there's questions, and then I'm going to kind of go into a different section. Okay. All right, I'm just going to keep cruising. So we were just talking about the whole entire budget, all funds combined. So now I want to just kind of hone in on the general fund. It is the largest fund of our budget, represents the biggest portion of our spending, and just want to highlight those dollars for you as well. So our total general fund budget is $101.8 million proposed for next year. It's a slight decrease, about a 1% decrease from what the general fund budget is currently this year. When we look at our budgeted operating resources in our general fund for next year, they total $89.8 million. That's an increase of about 2.8%. And when we look at our general fund operating resources, so kind of starting to narrow down, excluding all the other funds, there's really two primary sources of revenue in our general fund, and that's the state school fund formula and our local option levy. So our state school fund formula represents 86% of the revenue in our general fund, and it's a combination of our local property taxes, not including the local option levy, the state school fund grant. So when we talk about the state school fund and the allocation at the state level, that's part of this conversation. It also includes a little bit of what we call other local revenues, and so those would be receipts we receive from the common school fund, and some pretty low dollars we might receive like through federal forest fees or from county school funds, which again come to us through intermediate sources. Our local option levy represents 11% of our general fund operating revenues, budgeted next year at $9.6 million. So going back to that levy and the community support for our schools is a big chunk of our general fund budget, and it does fund over 70 FTE in the proposed budget for next year. So without that, things would look a lot different for us. So this is a breakdown of the state school fund formula revenues. So those three categories we just talked about. The state school fund grant is the bottom color. The property tax is the middle color. Other local revenues is really small when we look at the big picture. But we are including $77 million in the proposed budget for next year. So comparing that to the current year budget, it's about a 2.1% increase. So you'll notice with our resources and our revenues, our increases are kind of all in this general area, like 2 to 2.5%, kind of in that low 2% range. I want you to keep that in mind, because when we start talking about expenses, those changes are a much higher number than these low 2s. I'll try to explain a local option levy in 30 seconds. It's very complicated. So for each of the years you see here, there's 3 different bars, and it's kind of hard to see the numbers, but the bar on the left side of each year represents the levy as imposed at the $1.50 per thousand of assessed value. So if we just think about the levy amount is $1.50, if that was applied to the assessed values of all the properties within the district boundaries, that's the number that you would receive. Local option levies are different than other types of property taxes. And so when there is a significant difference between the assessed value and the real market value of a property, we start to look at something called compression. And so the local option levy is not always, this is going to kind of seem weird, but everyone pays a different rate when it comes to the local option levy. So if you actually calculated what you're paying, some people might be paying $1.50, but oftentimes it's a lower amount. And so it's all based on the gap between your assessed value and your real market value. And it's kind of complicated, but you can see that the difference between what $1.50 looks like and what we're actually receiving, there's a pretty big difference. Although that difference has shrunk over the last few years because real market values started increasing substantially, and there's a cap on growth of assessed value. So when you get your property tax bill, your assessed value cannot increase by more than 3% from one year to the next. And so those things started going at different paces, and that's when compression for us became a little bit lower. And so as an example, in next year's proposed budget, the tax amount at $1.50 represents about $12 million. When we look at the actual amount after compression, it goes down to $9.9 million, and then we assume we're going to collect about 96% each year, and so then it goes down to 9.5. So the proposed budget includes $9.5 million of local option levy revenue. That was more than 30 seconds, I'm sorry. It's kind of impossible, I don't know. It's tricky. Okay, so on the other end of the spectrum, when we talk about our spending, For our general fund, our operating requirements total $90.9 million for next year in our proposed budget. When we look at the change from one year to the next, it's a 0.7% increase, and again, that's reflective of our need to pare back on our spending and get our budget more balanced. When we look at our general fund spending, again, salaries and associated payroll costs make up the majority of that at $71.5 million, or 79% of our general fund budget. And then you can see purchase services makes up the other portion. The majority of our purchase services is our contracted student transportation services. We spend about $6 million a year on that, so that makes up a big chunk of that purchase service. So I want to talk about, general fund operating resources and requirements. When I presented those two numbers, they didn't match. The budget is balanced technically, but we're still planning to spend a little bit more in our general fund than what we will receive. It's not necessarily uncommon. It's what's been happening for the last few years for us. But I do want to explain how we budget the reserves and how that's different than like the actual reserves when we like do our audit and when we present financial information to the board. So in the budget, in the proposed budget for next year, in the general fund, there's a total of $9.4 million that's budgeted, and it's either budgeted as a contingency or as an unappropriated ending fund balance. That number represents 10.5% of our operating resources in our general fund. Our board policy requires us to have 3 different reserve accounts totaling 12.5% of our operating resources. When we budget for reserves, we assume that we don't spend 100% of our budget each year. So we look back over multiple years and identify a trend of what percent of our budget do we actually spend. We usually spend about 98% of our budget. So when we're planning the budget for the new year, we budget the reserves at a lower level, assuming that we're not going to spend 100% of our budget, and at the end of the year, that will go into the ending fund balance and be calculated as those reserves. I just want to be transparent about that because it's kind of hard to understand sometimes. I would also say that like if in the middle of the year, we think that we might be spending more than 98% of our budget, that's the time when Ryan and I would come to the school board in alignment with your policy to say, hey, we are thinking we might be below that mark that you've set, and it's important for us to communicate that to you, and then we would talk about the kinds of things that we'd be doing to address that issue. It hasn't happened yet, but just being transparent. So when we think about the budget, but then I actually put that 2% back in there, this is what our projected ending fund balance is for the end of next year, 12.5% of operating resources. And so when we look at actuals over the last 3 years, plus what we're projecting, you can see that the last 3 years we've used about $2.5 million of extra reserves to balance our budgets. So we've been operating at a deficit. We'll be operating at a deficit this year. We operated at a deficit last year and the year prior as well. So we're kind of down to that 12.5% mark, and that's what's forcing, the reduction in spending to meet that mark. And the budget that you have tonight and the difference between our general fund operating resources and our general fund operating requirements is about $800,000. So we're still planning to use about $800,000 of ending fund balance the budget for next year, and then go from there. As Ryan was saying, there's a lot of things we're having to pay close attention to next year, and this will be one of them as well. Since in my tenure in the district, we haven't been at that level before, but again, it's important for us to monitor that and make sure that we keep the board informed if we think that that's going to start to look any different. Questions before I move on? I feel like I'm just facing one way. Okay.
So if you can maybe you'll talk more about this later on, but that's, if you can talk more about the decision-making about spending that amount right now versus the next year of the biennium, and how does that maybe relate to, how are we going to see ourselves in a year? So maybe talk more about those parameters, and a follow-up question, or maybe in light with that question is, how many FTEs is that $806,000?
Well, if our budgeted cost per FTE is $104,000, it's about 8. Yeah. And really like high level, if everything just stayed exactly the same and it was just status quo, so we know that we're using $800,000 of the reserves for next year, and we know that we're using $2.4 million of our ESSER funds to fund staffing next year. So we know, like, if nothing else changed and everything stayed the same, we'd have to reduce our budget by $3.2 million next year just to, like, get back on the same playing field, right? Granted, there's a ton of stuff that can change on both sides. Like, our resources can change, things will change there, spending may start to change. But those two components are things we're very aware of. We know the ESSER funds are a little tricky because we received a lot of these relief dollars in a one-time fashion to address needs brought on by the pandemic. It's really hard to spend that much money on like one-time expenses, especially when we're trying to address student needs. And so, as Ryan said in his message, we hired a lot of staff at a time when our students needed that additional staffing. And so we'll just have to prioritize over time and re-examine. And that's part of our budget parameters, right? Just constantly re-examining our spending and analyzing like what's working and what's not. And just being open to as much innovation as possible. The blending and braiding of funds has been a pretty significant undertaking in the last few years, and it does require a lot of collaboration, a lot of brainstorming, and a lot of creativity. And so I anticipate a lot more of that as well over the next 6 to 9 months as we continue to keep our eyes on all these moving targets. Yeah.
Mr. Chair? I have a question. Olivia, when you were talking about the proportion of administrative staff versus all others, you cited the statistic of 4%. If memory serves, that's a bit lower than what we've seen historically. Can you talk about the history of administrative staffing levels, appropriation of administration historically, and is this a change, or am I misremembering? In terms of like that 43 FTE that we've planned to reduce for next year's budget, that does include one administrative position. So the budget for next year does reflect a decrease in that category of staffing. But we've, like all the other categories in the last 4 to 5 years, we've added to that category as well. And so when we look at it from a proportionality, I mean, 1 FTE for a much smaller group, it's a bigger percent. But we know that, again, knowing what's coming over the next couple of years, we know that we're going to have to continue to analyze all levels of staffing in all groups. And I think when we were putting the budget together for next year, we knew it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to be reducing staffing and not be looking at all the different employee groups. We don't look at it as like a last in, first out type of situation either. Sometimes I think that's a misconception that, the last positions we've added or, that those would be the first ones to go. And especially with the way we've utilized our new state funds through the student investment account and the high school success grant, we wouldn't just turn around and move a bunch of general fund expenses into those grants. We can't technically anyway because they have some restrictions on how we can use them. But again, like at this point in time, our priorities are just to look at ways that have the least impact on students and as far away as the classroom as possible.
completely
And that
understand.
administrative position is a district office level position and not at a school.
Right. I've shared this critique the whole 10 years I've been on this board. I've noticed that this district has historically run its administrative staff lean, and I have heard time and again complaints from staff that our district office struggles to be responsive to needs. We heard that a lot from our educators this year. And so while I understand that you feel you have to have some proportional reduction and just to make reductions fair, I want to make sure that the district office is able to be responsive and supportive of our whole district, so we have an integrated system, that we can maintain an integrated system that can be accountable to this community and still deliver on our expectations. So that's just getting my last crack in. It's my last year. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a couple questions? Sure, and then Bill. So the first one is process, and then the other one's more substantive. On process, I guess, and I apologize if you all already know this, but I'm wondering, what was the input that went into these decisions being made as far as, I understand that they are data-driven qualitatively and quantitatively, which I appreciate. But how much input was sought and obtained from the educators that are, on the ground with the students to give their input on what areas can suffer more cuts and have the least impact on students? That's my first question. Then the second one is, again, zeroing in on the 43 FTE. What other cuts were considered but rejected in favor of reducing the 43 FTE?
Like non-staffing types of
Well,
expenses or
any
other
cuts, 'cause-
types of
'cause
staff?
what I've heard from the community, obviously, is that you hear a lot of concerns about the impact on students from losing 43 FTE. And I understand and appreciate that. I don't know what the other options were to be cut, so I'm assuming that other cuts were considered, but it was decided that those would have a worse impact on students than reducing the 43 FTE. I just don't know what those other options were that were considered. I haven't really heard other options suggested by anyone. I just know that me, like a lot of the community, is concerned about losing 43 FTE for the benefit of our students, but I don't know what other options we have to balance the budget.
Sure.
Do you want me to go first?
You want to take the first one? I'll take the second one.
Process was the first one.
Yeah, so I'll just take both of them.
Okay.
So first I want to go back a step, and that is that when we received those federal dollars, relief dollars, one of the things that we made a concerted effort to do is to spend those in classrooms. There were examples from other places across the country that spent those dollars, one because they were one time on facilities or some other areas. What we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that as kids came back out of the pandemic, that in our kindergarten and first grade classrooms, wherever we could have 2 adults, we wanted to have 2 adults. And so when we made that decision, we also knew that we were going to have to make some reductions a couple of years down the road because they were one-time dollars. So in terms of context, I think that's an important piece to share, just because we made the decision in the midst, actually via Zoom in the midst of the pandemic, that as we came back, that's what we were going to do. As we build the budget, we work primarily with our principals, who are coming together as leadership teams to make determinations about where the reductions need to happen at the school levels. So primarily where we're working is through our principals, and they're receiving input from their staff and helping us to make decisions. And so that is, in terms of the process, we start that usually around November as we work towards the budget that we shared with you tonight. And that's been the same when we've had the opportunity to add investment as well as reduce. Oftentimes our principals who work together as a cohort come to us with proposals in terms of what they want to invest in. Another example of that is for this upcoming year, one of the areas that they wanted to make an adjustment in was looking at, we've had positions called assessment techs in our schools, and they asked primarily at the elementary school to move away from that function because it was focused so much on standardized assessment and moving to having a certified person who provided more structure in terms of an overall system of academic support. So they came with a proposal to make that change based on what they saw happening in some of our buildings in terms of what they saw as best practice, and as they brought that forward as a proposal. So that's one example.
So that was from the principals. Was that the TOSA Dean of Students increase of 738,000?
No, that would be the
MTSS.
the MTSS. That's a different, another acronym, but that is multi-tier systems of support, and that's that example. The dean example is this having a certified staff member at each one of our schools who is working alongside our teachers. And we have had that in some of our elementary schools and not all of our elementary schools. Where we've had them, they've had successes. And it was an example of, again, of principals coming together and saying, where we have deans, we're finding successes. As we think about what we need to do next, as we continue to recognize kids are coming back to us out of a pandemic, we see this as an important strategy that we should employ across the whole school district. So those are a couple of examples of how those conversations have gone.
And then the second question was, I mean, were there other categories that you could consider cutting, but you decided not to in the proposed budget?
So typically about 80% of our budget is on 85% is in the policy around staffing. So the majority of our dollars go towards employees. Historically, when districts have had challenging fiscal times, they've looked at two things. They've looked at reducing the number of staff, and they've looked at reducing the number of school days in terms of furlough. And so those are the two most common practices because they are the two that have the most financial impact or the financial weight. We've actually also looked at reductions in other categories. Our facilities department has taken reductions in the number of projects that they're planning to do over the next 12 months. We've looked at our maintenance budget, which is separate from that kind of the structural piece, and we've made reductions there. Our technology department, our tech director brought us a budget, and we sent it back and said, you need to make additional reductions in whatever you're spending related to technology. So it has not been a standalone only staffing. We've been looking at each one of our, each area of our schools and been looking at where we can make reductions there as well.
Yeah,
Thank
I would
you.
add two things. When we start formulating staffing for a new year, it's kind of, the things that Ryan were talking about were pretty adaptive, like in terms of conversation and collaboration. There's also some technical components to what we do when we determine what our projected enrollment is going to be for the following year, because we do use class size formulas to determine staffing levels as well. So it's kind of a mix. So some of it's pretty technical because we're doing, equations to determine, okay, if we're serving less students, we might have one less teacher at a specific school and things like that. But then these types of conversations come into play. I'd also go back a couple of slides. So when I presented general fund operating requirements, it reflected a decrease of 1% from our current year budget. When we presented the information on salaries and associated costs, it represented a negative 0.1%. So we are definitely disproportionately reducing other types of spending outside of salaries and benefits as much as possible. So I just want to kind of point that out too. It represents a huge part of our budget. It's really hard to reduce the amount we had to without staffing reductions, but we are reducing in other areas at a higher rate than what we're doing in terms of the dollars that we're budgeting.
Bill, then Therese.
Olivia, could you just trace the beginning fund balance from the actual to the estimated to the budgeted amount? And how was that decision made?
Are you talking about using that money to balance the budget, or just to?
How you start, how much existed in the actual, and how much was estimated? And
Yeah.
how much you're budgeting to be a beginning fund balance?
Sure. I can use the current year as an example. Our actual beginning fund balance in the current year was less than what we budgeted, which hasn't happened to me in a long time, and it's not.
How big was that figure,
I don't have it off the top of my head.
just roughly?
I don't know. I really don't. I'm sorry. But that's kind of unusual for us. In my role, I don't want to be in that position usually, and so we try to be pretty conservative when we think about what the rollover will be from one year to the next. But this year, it was a little bit less than what we had anticipated. And that's hard too, because you have to you have to reconcile that, because you don't really have an option. I'll follow up on that with you, Bill.
Okay, Therese?
Thanks. I have a couple questions. Just really quickly, you mentioned that one of the 43 positions was a district office position, but what is the breakdown of the 43 FTE?
Sure. So of the 43 FTE, it breaks down to 1.84 FTE certified, 39.11 FTE classified, 1.0 administrator, and 0.88 FTE other non-represented staff.
Okay. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
So my next question is, so let's say that we somehow we get $10.3 billion approved. What changes would you make to this budget if that happened? What changes would you want to make? I realize you can't tell me, like, I would change this line item, but what would be the changes you'd be prioritizing if we were to get more than the $9.9 billion?
I think I'd be prioritizing what we can do to reduce the reliance on one-time funds for ongoing expenses. If the state school fund allocation did increase, my other concern around that is that we have multiple assumptions built into the budget, and until we're further down the road and we know what the outcomes of some of these assumptions are going to be, I'd be really hesitant to spend that. I'm going to talk about assumptions next, so perfect lead-in, Therese, because I do think there are three things that are assumed about next year that can really drive changes within the budget, both positive or negative.
Great. And then just one more question and then a comment. I know we brought on people with the one-time dollars, and I'm really appreciative that you're reminding anybody that's listening to this that we didn't know when we got those dollars that without a significant increase from the state, that level of increase in our, all of our programming and our staffing wouldn't be sustainable on a standard budget. So that is a good thing for us to remember. How many people did we bring on with one-time dollars that we knew we may not be able to have a way to hold on to?
Sure. The current year budget includes 33 FTE of that one-time ESSER dollars right now.
And have we reduced any of those one-time dollar positions prior to this year?
No.
Okay. So those one-time dollars brought in 33? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Well, we're currently funding 33 positions this year with that money.
With that money, okay. And so, okay, all right, that helps. And then I know you're going to go on to assumptions, and I'm glad for that. I would like to make a comment about one reference or one phrase that we have used, which makes perfect sense, except I think maybe it might not quite be right on it. It's when we talk about the choices that make the least amount of impact on kids. That phrase a little bit concerns me because it's a very subjective phrase. Depending on who you are, what makes the least amount of impact could be quite different. And so I'm wondering if we might consider, instead of framing this as our budget choices have minimized the impact on students, we might say that we are attempting with our budget to prioritize particular outcomes that we've determined in the district are essential, realizing we don't have enough funds, these dollars, and not one cut that we're making is not going to impact our students, right? And the algorithm that leads to the determination of least amount of impact, we just can't quantify that. And so I'm just expressing, I think it would be really helpful to make sure we're messaging to the community that in no way do we actually think that these changes aren't equally impactful as other changes available to us. There are other reasons besides that that have driven these particular ones, and those are important, and maybe the community needs to hear those, but it is 100% not because the changes we are making are not going to have dramatic impact. That's all, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Sure, go ahead.
And Olivia and Ryan, please feel free to hold this until after we discuss assumptions, because that might be more appropriate. But coming from the corporate world, I see that, in looking at this budget and being familiar with budgets, it feels like there's a big revenue problem, and we aren't talking enough about that revenue problem. And I repeatedly heard Ryan say that it's due to decreasing birth rates and affordable housing in Corvallis. However, if we look at the alternate schools here in Corvallis, like Ashbrook, Sandy Am Christian, Waldorf, and Zion, those 4 schools combined have over 975 students. So if you brought back half those students, you would be at your 2019 levels. And that doesn't include schools like LC, who has opened up their enrollment and has increased by 238 students from 2019. And I follow real estate slightly. I have not seen that many houses for sale in LC. And again, that doesn't include something like Kings Valley Charter School. Having an incoming kinder student, I'm also aware that many of these schools that I've just mentioned are currently having wait lists for their kindergarten classrooms. And I believe, as a parent of an incoming kinder student, that further cuts to the school district and additional poor publicity for the school district will exacerbate this trend in the upcoming years. I'm interested, and I think that Vince was very complimentary of the administration, but I'd be interested in how the 33-ish staff members being compensated $4.2 million last year are planning on curtailing this, and what that plan is to go forward.
Are you wanting us to address the enrollment component or the revenue problem that we have, or just the fact that they're interrelated?
Well, I think that the enrollment problem is related to the revenue problem is related to the enrollment. And I think that without addressing this, you're going to further hemorrhage students from the district.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we do a lot of advocacy work at the state level to advocate for adequate levels of funding, and that funding is provided to us on a per student basis, right? So it is kind of a vicious cycle of the two things combined when they're both in a not positive trend can be doubly harming to some degree. I also think, the private schools in our area, the wait list thing, whether that's like a new thing for them or not, but I don't know that their enrollments have necessarily looked that different than they did 5 years ago. I think they've always had those same levels of enrollment. And I also think that we're not opponents to like parental choices and parents making those choices. And we collaborate with our private schools with our Title I funds. I mean, so we have positive collaborative relationships with them, and they utilize some of our federal funds to collaborate with professional development activities and things like that. So, I think we have a positive relationship with our private schools, but one of the issue around enrollment and choice, I think, is really an individual family decision. Less students enrolling in the schools does have a negative impact on us financially. But if we're serving less kids, we're also, there are other things that should start to look different if we're serving less kids overall as well.
So what I'm hearing you say is that there's no plan from the administration to try to drive these students back into the school district.
Like public relations type stuff?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So school districts don't really advertise that way. There's some rules around the ways we can spend money towards advertising that are unique to school districts, which is probably different than that corporate train of thought you're bringing to this. The things that I can track and measure are things like the number of kids that go to homeschool. And so we have, I have tracked that pre-pandemic, through the pandemic, and post-pandemic. And what we have seen there is that we have about the same number of students now as pre-pandemic that are in homeschool. The other measure that I can track is I can track the number of students that are in an online school, like a virtual charter, and that there's rules around less than 3% of students can participate in those from any single district. Our numbers has not been close to that, and nor does it have it hasn't been close to that, and it hasn't really gone up because we started Corvallis online in the middle of the pandemic. And then the third thing I can track is I can track the number of kids transferring into the district through inter-district transfers, and we have more kids coming in to our district this upcoming year than we had last year. So there's a positive trend in students enrolling who live in neighboring districts that are coming to our schools. Primarily this year, we're seeing that at Garfield. We're seeing that at both Linus Pauling and Sheldon, and we're seeing that at Crescent Valley. Some of that has to do with where we have space in terms of schools that aren't closed to transfers, but that is another thing that I'm seeing moving in a positive direction.
So I will mention that I spent some time looking at these schools and their enrollment trends, and their enrollment trends are going up. It's all available online on these individual websites for these locations. So I definitely think that that's concerning, considering it directly impacts our at-risk students or our students here in the Corvallis School District. And I think that that should be considered in upcoming enrollment numbers as well.
And that's something I'd be interested in sitting down with you and taking a look at.
Yeah, because they're not required to report that to the state. It's like the one component that we always have a hard time getting a grasp on.
Well, okay. Additionally, have we looked at other alternative revenue sources? So when I dug through the budget, and I got a little bit deep into it, so sorry if I'm getting in the weeds. So do we charge like a rental fee to organizations that use facilities for school programs, like after-school programs or anything like that? Is that on 1910 of the budget line? Rentals?
Yes.
Okay, so that's remained at $45,000 over the last like 5 years. And then looking at the organization that primarily drives that, like the Boys and Girls Club, who had a $3.2 million in net revenue in 2021, did we look at potentially like increasing those rental fees or other revenue generating options for the school district?
Per our board policy around facility use, the Boys and Girls Club is an entity that we don't charge for facility use because they primarily serve district students. And so if you go into the policy K section of the board policies, it's a pretty lengthy policy, but it does address different levels. Like there's different levels of organizations that we charge a full rate to, or maybe a reduced rate to, or no charge. Because that organization primarily serves district students, that's a no charge situation. So it varies on who the user is of what the fee charged is.
Okay, and in addition to that, did we look at other revenue generating options, like knowing that this has been lucrative to the Boys and Girls Club over the years? Have we looked at perhaps bringing that within the public school district to provide after-school care to further perhaps repurpose those 43 FTEs that are being impacted and further generate revenue for the district?
So I don't know that we're looking at doing any after-school programs that charge fees. We're looking at after-school programs and in the process of applying for the 21st Century Grant. That application is due next week, I think. So the Boys and Girls Club, that grant, the Boys and Girls Club is no longer an eligible partner under that grant, so the district is now applying for that grant for the next 5 years to provide academic intervention-related after-school programs. But running after-school programs, like with tuition or fees, is not something that the district has looked at in the last few years. And I don't know that it's necessarily been a high priority for us because we have such a hard time staffing our schools during the regular day that I think it's been a challenge. I know it's been a challenge for the Boys and Girls Club to staff their programs. And so I think our priority is definitely around students who have an academic intervention need and serving those kids first. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add to that. That's the application, right?
Yeah, the 21st Century Grant is $500,000 every year that we can ask for. What we're trying to do is replace some of what has been happening at our Title I schools, specifically Lincoln and Garfield, and Letitia Carson, with a program to provide academic and social emotional enrichment in the afternoon, or intervention as well. But I mean, it's a grant program and it's highly competitive, but we're putting in an application because we're not going to leave money on the table.
Okay, I do have a couple questions as well. The first one is, you said that you knew that a lot of these FTEs were going to have to be temporary because they were sent with one-time funds. Were those positions posted as limited term? So where, you know, the people who applied for it knew that, hey, there's no promise that you're going to have this next year, 2 years, 3 years from now. And the other one is, what are the 21 FTE that are currently being funded with that 2.4 million in ESSER funds, and what are we going to do with them when those funds expire?
So one of the strategies we used this year is we put into place, I think in January we put into place a practice that if there was a position that was vacated, that the principal needed to put in a request to our small executive team, which is made up of Melissa as assistant superintendent, Olivia as business director, our human resources director, Jennifer Duvall, and myself. And we looked at each one of those positions that came through as a request from principals. And in that process, we made a decision on which ones needed to be posted and filled, which ones could we live without. And we also looked at which positions needed to be posted as limited term and those that needed to be posted as more permanent positions. And some of those decision-making strategies came to, is this a hard-to-fill position? Is it a position that we know that we've had a difficult time filling year over year? So some of those considerations went into place. But many of the positions that we posted January on were limited term positions. And so one of the things that's happening is that we are not, many of the staff members are staying with us. And because the positions that were often posted were limited term, so we have not had to go through an extensive process of layoff and recall. We've been able to work through that process as limited term for the most part, trying to limit as much as possible any sorts of layoffs. That hasn't been perfect, but it has helped us quite a bit in that process. And then you had a second question, but I can't remember.
I believe it was something along the, what is the plan to do with the 21 FTE currently funded by the 1.2 in ESSER funds?
So I think it's early. 2.4, sorry. Yeah, I think two things. One, it's early for us to say that because there are some, we know that there are some assumptions built into the budget. We also know that there isn't a state school fund that's been approved yet. So there's things that we know are going to go into place. I do anticipate that we'll have a similar process in place for the upcoming school year once we hire and fill positions for the beginning of the year to look at as the year goes on if positions become vacated, looking at that process once again in a similar fashion. It does a few things for us. One is it makes us be really intentional about what positions we're wanting to fill, and it also allows us to slow those processes down where they need to be slowed down, so we can also think about, are there folks in other buildings, or are there other ways we can look at the staff we currently have in a different way? So we're looking at all those factors in that process.
So thank you for those answers, and I have a still missing part or missing piece of how much of the state school fund proposed $9.9 billion budgets for the state is contributing to our reductions. So you highlighted that declining enrollment contributed to some reductions. One-time money investments will contribute to some reductions. But also the fact that you shared with us, if I remember the number correctly, regardless where the student is, per ADMW, the state is giving us this year only 1.1% increase in the money allocated per student per ADMW. So if that number is correct, that 1.1% increase rather than keeping up with the increases that we're actually experiencing in reality, how much is that contributing to the 43 FTE reductions?
So when we look at the general fund, separate from all funds, the number of staffing reductions made in the general fund was 12 FTE. So it's a much, when we think about that, it's a much smaller, percentage of those staffing reductions. So in the general fund, the majority of the reductions were not related to staffing. We addressed all those, like you're going to go after all the other things before you, it's hard to avoid when you spend 80% of your budget on that. So the majority of those reductions are all related to grants. And it's not just ESSER grant, and we got ARPA federal relief dollars too to provide like an additional year of education for our wings and transition students. And again, so we hired some EAs to serve those kids who turned 21 but didn't exit our system yet, so we were allowed to serve them for another year. So again, that's another example of a temporary one-time funding. We hired staff. All of those staff positions were hired as limited term positions, and this is the end of that additional year of service for those students who are now 22. So it was great because they got to have that extra year, because during the pandemic, so much of the work they do is like volunteer and work service in the community, and so during the pandemic, it was a huge loss, and so it was great for us to be able to do that. And so there was staffing attached to that. There was staffing attached to the ESSER funds. And then, just from one year to the next, we have a lot of moving parts between all the different special revenue funds that we have and the grant funds. So the majority of those staffing reductions aren't inside the general fund, they're outside of the general fund, and primarily around grants, and then primarily around one-time money tied to grants.
Thank you so much.
You want to resume? Yes. Okay.
Actually, Mr. Chair? Yes. Can the committee stand at ease for 5 minutes?
There's no objection. I don't hear any, sure. We're recessed for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the indulgence.
There we go. Okay, now that everybody is back, let us resume.
Okay. So that quick restroom break allowed me to get an answer for Bill real quick. And I had another follow-up too. So Bill, this current year, we budgeted a beginning fund balance of $14.3 million, and our actual beginning fund balance was 13.6. Yes. So our actual beginning fund balance was about $675,000 less than what we had anticipated it to be. Good? Okay. And then Courtney, I wanted to follow up when I made a reference about private schools reporting enrollment data to the state. We know their total enrollments, but the information we're always interested in is residency, and they don't report in, like, all public school entities in the state report enrollment, but when they do that, we also know like where those students live. So what we don't know is the residency of private school enrollments, like the total enrollments. We have that information. We use that when we do our Title I applications. But we don't get information in terms of like, of those students, how many of them live in the Corvallis School District boundary. I just wanted to clarify that. There's information there, but sometimes it's not necessarily like the best information for us.
And to that point, I was looking at trending data over time. Is that something that the district keeps track of year over year for the private schools?
Yeah, I mean, we're required, like through our federal grant programs, we're required to connect with all the private schools in our area each year. Enrollment information is part of that component. And we offer them to join us in participating in some of our federal grant programs. They have the choice whether they want to or not, and not all of them do. I think this year we're working with Zion, and maybe that might be it. I know we've worked with Sandy M. Christian in the past. So we always reach out, we make that offer, and they're more than willing to join us on the professional development activities we provide with those federal funds, and that's a requirement. We are required to like reach out, make contact, make the offer, and it all has to be documented. It's part of our federal requirements. Mm-hmm. When we get the enrollment information, though, we don't necessarily ask of that number how many of those students live in the Corvallis boundary. We could start doing that and see if they would be willing to provide that information to that. But sometimes I don't think they have an easy, like with our state systems, it's automated. Like every district has a code, and so I'm not sure they'd have to know like all of the different district boundaries and put in an address and figure out like I think it would be really like a big manual project for them to probably do. But not saying that it couldn't happen. Okay. So let's talk about some assumptions. I'm not going to talk about all of the assumptions that are built into the budget because there's lots, but I did want to talk about the three that I think are the ones that have the most potential to change, particularly around resources and spending. So the first one is student enrollment. And so our projection for next year is 6,378 students. We include Muddy Creek Charter School in that number, so that 6,378 includes Muddy Creek Charter School. So the number on top is all charter and non-charter enrollment. The number below is just the non-charter enrollment, so district schools. So next year's enrollment, we're projecting 3 less students, so not too bad. But again, hard to say what that actually looks like until we see the whites of their eyes in the fall. So the official enrollment count is always done on October 1 of each year, and so starting in August, when schools start completing registration processes, we start a lot of two-way communication with our schools around what their numbers are looking like,
And then through the first 3 to 4 weeks of September, those are numbers that we're looking at. Well, in the beginning of the year, we look at it multiple times a week, and then we go to about once a week after that.
Can I ask a quick question on that? Because I remember this from the last meeting that you had excluded Muddy Creek. And here, I'm just looking at the top number, and it actually doesn't go down by 3, it goes up by 16, right?
Right.
So why in some calculations are you taking out Muddy Creek?
Well, because the funding we get for Muddy Creek, we pass through to them. And so, and when we budget for Muddy Creek enrollment, I always budget at their maximum enrollment, which is 125. If they, so it just allows for us to receive the funding at that level so that we can pass it through to them if they get to that level. They are not there now. They've been close in the pre-pandemic, but they're getting back to that number. And so for budget purposes, I use the maximum enrollment that's in the charter school contract. For district enrollment purposes, though, that's a true like projection based on cohort survival ratios and looking at birth rates and stuff like that. So it does look different. We had the number on top prior to, well, in 1920 and 2021, it also included Yes House, which was an alternative program that was also under the district's umbrella as well. And now it's really just the district, schools, non-charter enrollment, and then charter enrollment. 125 is what their maximum is. Okay, so this is kind of like this is the big one. The budget assumes a state school fund allocation of $9.9 billion. That is the amount that was recommended by the governor in her budget that was released in January. The Ways and Means Committee released their budget framework in March, same number. Really haven't seen a lot of traction or movement on this in the last couple of months. Lots of advocacy around it, but not lots of traction. And so we know that the revenue forecast that came out this week was very positive, and kind of prompted us to do another round of advocacy work. And so we will wait and see what that looks like. But when we look at the state school fund allocation, how that works, so the state operates on a biennial budget, and we operate on an annual budget. And so we are starting a new biennium on July 1 at the state level. And so when they allocate this amount, it gets split into each of those 2 years. And it's generally allocated, they allocate 49% of that in the first year and 51% in the second year. And so this chart really represents what the current allocation is this year, which is $4.74 billion. That's the state number, not the district number. So the current allocation for this current year is $4.74 billion. That's 51% of $9.3 billion, which is what the current biennial allocation is. If the biennial allocation for 23-25 is $9.9 billion, and we get 49% of that in the first year, then the number is $4.85 billion. And when you look at that, it's really just an increase of 2.3%. Going back to that whole low 2%, we know our costs are increasing at a much higher rate than that. And so that is kind of the issue around the state school fund not growing at the rate that we would like to see. So in terms of, let me go back one. So I get asked this question a lot. So if it's 10-1 or if it's 10-3, what does that mean for the district? And it's about $1 million for every $200 million increments. And so if the allocation goes from 9-9 to 10-1, we'll get about, and again, this is like if everything else stayed the same, which it never does, we'd get about an extra $1 million of state revenue. If the allocation goes up to 10.3 billion, we'd get about $2 million more in state revenue. So those are things we pay attention to and continue to advocate for. The Oregon legislature does have a job to do and a budget to adopt, and they do have a deadline to do that. The Ways and Means Committee already sort of approved the budget at $9.9 billion. So there's no worry about us not getting 9.9, like about them not finishing the work. But again, we know that they're also under an extreme amount of pressure from all sides, and there's lots of competing interests right now. And so we'll kind of wait to see how that shakes out over the next couple of weeks. we remain cautiously optimistic. So the assumption that probably has the biggest impact on our budget, so state school fund, you know, if it went to 10.3, that's an extra $2 million. That's fantastic. But we're currently bargaining with our largest employee group right now, and so those costs are significant. They make up the biggest percentage of our budget. And so the outcome of that can also dramatically drive the spending side of our budget, not the resources side of our budget. So we're currently bargaining with our certified group. We have a contract in place next year with our classified group. We don't have a contract with our non-rep group in place yet either. And so we have two groups where I don't have any documentation to go back and say, okay, this is what the salaries are going to be for next year. So in that situation, we have to make an assumption. And so in next year's proposed budget that you have in front of you tonight, so if there is no contract in place, we're making the assumption that those staff are going to get a 5% COLA. So that's a lot higher than what we've been offering in the last few years in the district. But it is, you know, relevant and competitive based on what we know around what's been happening and just the real reality that everything is costing more, and the expectation is that increasing salaries and benefits is something that we just have to accept, knowing that our funding doesn't grow at that same rate, and so it just requires some reconciliation, but it is still obviously a huge priority, especially when we're spending the majority of our budget in this area. Another thing that does add up quite a bit are the health insurance benefits we pay or we provide to employees. The district makes a contribution on behalf of every employee every month to apply to those premiums. This is something where we don't have any contracts in place for next year for any employee groups. And so our classified contract had a limited reopener, and so this is an area that we're currently bargaining with our classified group just around insurance. And again, still bargaining with our certified group and no agreement with our non-rep group, and so making the assumption that we're going to add $50 per month to whatever the current monthly contribution is. Questions before I move on?
I have one. So you talked about, you know, 5% COLA and whatnot, and as a member of a public employees union that's also going through bargaining right now, I understand both sides of it. But that was a point I brought up last year was, you know, knowing that inflation was going to be so high, we knew that COLA increases were probably going to be high. 5% does seem like a pretty good number, honestly. But what plans do we have going forward even beyond this? Because I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. Do we have any contingencies in place? Because it doesn't sound like funding from the state is going to go up enough to match this increase that our educators certainly deserve these increases. So do we kind of have a plan maybe percolating in the back of our minds on how we can address this, knowing that revenue is probably not going to keep up with it?
So I would say right now is we're still pretty early on in the process to have like narrowed down what that might look like. If the costs that we like agree to eventually through bargaining are more than what we budgeted, and nothing else changed, which we know is never the case, there would have to be trade-offs to that. We would have to reduce in another area. The more likely scenario is that it's probably going to be a combination of multiple factors. There might be some like extra resources here or there, some trade-offs here or there. We don't usually approach that for like a one-for-one type of trade-off scenario. And so, but I do think it's too early for us to kind of make an assumption around where we will land compared to what we are assuming in the budget. That's just my opinion. I don't know if you have a different opinion on that, but.
Again, it's early, and we're working to determine how many years the contract goes. We know that we will be negotiating again with classified in a year, so we just have to continue to pay attention to those factors as we move forward. And we also understand inflation is real, and we know that at the state level, there's, as I think about the next upcoming biennium, that there's, a lot of unknowns. Not just the future at biennium, but even 2 years out. So there's just a lot to unpack in that question, to be quite honest.
So I want to unpack one thing here. Thank you for sharing that and for sharing the assumption, really trusting that our association and district staff will prioritize children, families, and our working force in the decision making. But a question I have is the sustainability of our assumptions. And I'm wondering, because the state budget, when the committee passed 9.9, I read somewhere a keyword that they called it historic. And I'm not sure if they meant it in the positive manner or not. For me, I think this is disastrously historic. And maybe this is a rhetorical question, but does the Fiscal Budget Office have an assumption of COLA? And what's that number? Because how did they reach to 2-point-something%, and there's no place in the state where cost of living is increasing by that percentage? And as you mentioned, most of our state fund is going to salaries. So do we know if they have in the fiscal office an assumption for the COLA that they plug in to bring in the 9.9 and call it historic?
I don't know what COLA they're assuming, but I know it's lower than what we're experiencing. And I think so across the state, districts collaborated when the governor's budget came out. And what Ryan referred to in his budget message as like that broadly determined current service level, that 10.3 number, that's more in line with talking about current service level, right? That doesn't mean we're adding, able to make more investments. That's just to maintain. And so we were one of the districts that participated in that statewide collaborative effort. And for us, 10.3 was that number where our general fund deficit, that's kind of when it started to look like really close to zero. That's when we knew, okay, that's the point where we're bringing in the same amount that we're spending and it starts to look flush again. So for us, 10.3, like we felt really strongly about that because in our experience, that was spot on where it needed to be. We know that in some districts, it might have been a little bit lower, even maybe higher than that. But yeah, so again, don't have a lot of control over that other than the advocacy work we can do. So it is kind of frustrating. I think a huge component of this is the biennial versus annual situation. So when the state looks at this, they're really looking at the whole 2-year scenario, and we look from like 1 year to the next. And so I think that alone is a huge difference in the computation, and one that we have to continue to argue about with them. Because they want to look at it from like, oh, this 2-year period to this 2-year period, but that's not how we operate, right? So it's just, it's challenging.
Thank you.
We have made, I would say this year, like the 9.9 billion governor's recommended budget, we did feel was progress from previous biennial cycles in terms of that initial number. We felt better about that initial number than we usually do, so that was a positive. And the whole historic thing, I mean, unless the budget was going down, it's a historically high. I mean, that's just, yeah, it's historic because it's $1 more than what it was last time. I don't know. I don't know how to describe that.
Thank you.
Okay. I just have one other kind of quick section I wanted to run through, just because the majority of our staffing that we have in the proposed budget for next year is directly allocated to schools. And so I want to run through this process really quick. There's information in the back of the budget document in the informational section that has all the details around the staffing allocations we provide to schools and the discretionary allocations we provide to schools, but I want to provide some context behind that. And this, Nikki, this kind of does go back to a little bit of like there's like some technical components of this, but there's also some adaptive components of this as well. So when we talk about classroom FTE,
For us, it's a pretty technical exercise based on our target class size. So one of the big factors when we built the budget for this year and based on our projected enrollment, so last year when we built the budget and we were looking at our classroom FTE allocations, we decided to use ESSER money to reduce our target class size by 1. So we spent about $1 million of ESSER money last year to keep our class sizes as low as we could, going back to that notion of what Ryan was talking about, right? We wanted to provide as much of that intentional support to students as we could. And so again, kind of having to reconcile to that, we take our projected enrollment, we plug that in, and we went back to our target class sizes, what they look like 2 years ago versus this year. So our target class size at the elementary level is 24, the middle school it's 27, and at the high school it's 29. The formula on this slide is really more relevant to elementary because it's pretty straightforward. When we talk about secondary enrollment, it gets a little bit more complicated because we look at the number of sections that we offer in the schedule, and a full-time teacher, you know, like at the high school, a full-time teacher will teach 6 out of 7 sections. We offer 7 sections. It's more complicated, but we provide our schools with the staffing so that all students can be enrolled in 7 periods a day at the high school, and well, all students are enrolled in 6 periods a day at the middle school. That's not really an issue. So, separate from classroom FTE at the elementary level, we offer that specialized instruction for PE, music, and art. And so our elementary schools are allocated FTE so that students can have 2 sessions of each of those 3 subjects each week. And then for basic school support, this is where it gets a little bit more adaptive. And these are generally areas where we make changes from one year to the next based on feedback from our principals. And it covers a pretty broad area from school administration, counseling and social work, instructional support, our school offices, the support we provide to students with classified staff, assessment, library, and athletics. So really broad. It's like all the other things that are happening at school that aren't classroom instruction. And then separate from staffing allocations, we also give our schools we give them a dollar allocation. So each school receives a discretionary allocation. It's based on a weighted enrollment and times a fixed amount per student. So each school gets a different amount per student based on their perceived need at that school. And then the fixed amount, it's kind of random, but elementary it's 205, middle school it's 335, and high schools it's 345. So all in all, we're allocating 258 FTE for classroom FTE, 18 FTE for our elementary enrichment, 384 FTE for basic school support, and we allocate $2.25 million to our schools for discretionary use. We don't put any parameters on the discretionary allocations. Our schools are allowed to use those funds however they see fit based on what they think is the best move for their school. So all in all, of the 863 FTE included in the proposed budget for next year, 660 FTE is allocated directly to schools through these formulas, which is 77% of our total FTE. I have lots of stats today. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. So that was kind of my summary of the proposed budget with a lot of numbers and charts and graphs. So I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Okay, I'm going to use chair's prerogative and ask the first question. Well, one more just popped into my head. Our reserve fund that we keep for, in reserve, is that in some form of interest earning account? Is there any way we've got that maybe doing a little bit of extra work for us?
Yeah, especially right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to it. We do have a board policy around investments. So there are some limitations as to what types of investments we're allowed to make. And especially after the bond proceeds were received. So in 2018, we issued the majority of the $199.9 million in general obligation bonds. And at that point in time, we put together a very comprehensive multi-year investment plan and structured multiple investments over different periods of maturity to mature at times to meet the cash flow for the bond program. So similar to other cash accounts, we do the same. Primarily, we invest in the local government investment pool, which is a vehicle through the Oregon State Treasury. And then we also work with Piper Sandler, which is a financial consulting firm, and they help us build multi-year investment portfolios based on the feedback we're providing around cash, like how much cash do we need and when do we need it. And so we have a financial analyst in the district who manages the investment program for the district as one of his duties, and so he's always in constant communication with them. And anytime we have an investment coming up for maturity, we have to kind of stop and be like, okay, do we reinvest? Do we reinvest for a shorter period of time, or do we need to let that mature because we need the cash flow? So, yes, and that's a pretty significant change in next year's proposed budget, because the last 3 years, the bond proceeds generated quite a bit of interest earnings through that, but just like the local government investment pool rate has gone up a lot in the last 12 months, and it's almost competitive again with a lot of these outside investments, which was not the case 2 years ago.
And because there's always rules around everything, what are we allowed to spend that money on?
The interest earnings?
Yes.
It's unrestricted revenue in the general fund. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'll open it up to any other questions from the committee. Shauna?
Okay. I brought a long list of questions. Now may not be the best moment for that, because I know we also have public comment and want to make space for that. But just going back to this particular section and to process. So thinking about process and also some of the assumptions. I know you talked about, and Ryan, you talked about too, that input comes in year-round, and we get input throughout the year, and some of the processes then to work with principals in terms of looking at budget. And in this particular year, with many of the funds that were dedicated to enhanced staffing, the plan always was sort of, we'll enhance staffing during this need and then step back when that needs to happen. What we've learned in that period of time is how critical that staffing is. And for that period of time, but also from the public comment we've been hearing from educators week after week after week who have been showing up, so much of what we have heard is that they are beyond maxed. And I think Krista Schmieder said a couple of weeks ago, we are broken. And just in hearing those words and listening to those words and thinking about veteran teachers who are leaving before their retirement, folks who thought they would be in education for a long time who are stepping out now. And they're asking us to look at things differently and engage their voices differently. So my big picture question, one is, are we stepping back, and rather than thinking about this as, okay, we had these funds, we use them for this purpose, and now let's move forward without those funds, or really looking at what do we do now with the funds we have and really make sure that as these budgets are developed, and I'm thinking about this too, if state funds are enhanced, and if we come out with 10.1 or 10.3 or some number we can't imagine today, but are hoping for, are there ways in this budgeting process that we can go back with that feedback loop and make sure educators are looking at this in terms of, is this offering the support you truly need right now? Is this what students truly need right now, both for educator well-being as well as student well-being? Because I think we're hearing really loudly and clearly, if our educators are not thriving, our students are not thriving. And so I think all of that comes down to that question of how can we better make sure we're integrating educator voice even in this budget process in a way that maybe we haven't in the past. I know we do listen as a district. We do really try to honor those voices. And it feels like a time, especially looking at the projected budget for the next 5 years being very similar with some cost of living increase, that the precedent set with this year's budget has the potential to impact the next 5 years. So
I can kind of approach that from more of a technical perspective and then kind of let Ryan take over. But in terms of like the technical preparation of the budget, I really go back to the board goals and the intended outcomes of those goals. That's what's primarily driving the budget process. So when we're beginning the early stages of budget development, the board reviews the fiscal policy. So like in December of 2022, you re-reviewed your fiscal policy. We readopted budget parameters in January. The board undertook a pretty significant engagement effort in the fall related to our integrated plan, right? So all of those actions and activities help to inform Ryan and myself to lead a lot of that work with our staff to then come back to, you know, the significant changes that might need to be made, which is a derivative of where we came to with some of the changes we're making at the elementary level. And so that's like a very technical way of looking at it, but in terms of budget development, it's all of those things that are driving the budget development from my perspective. And so the engagement you're talking about really is more related to those things than the budget itself, right? Because those are what is informing the development of the budget.
Did you say, but that engagement, like with the community, that's on the principal level, it's not on the educator level?
No, I think we did, I don't know, how many engagement sessions did you guys do this? 8? So we, as part of the integrated plan process for this school year, the board undertook a lot of different engagement sessions to get feedback on their goals. You want to speak to this? Go ahead. Or any board member can, I guess.
Yeah, and so we went to the community to talk about what are strengths of this community, what are potential barriers for students. We talked about the 5 board goal areas that we've had over time, which are student achievement, equitable systems, real-world learning, health and wellness in our facilities work, and received feedback on that. We had a work session last month focused on beginning to take that input into the development of the next round of board goals. Those previous board goals had been in place for over 5 years. And so this summer we plan to meet with the board and also additional staff in work in a retreat to begin to think about what are the modifications that need to be made to those board goals, because we really use that as part of the backbone in terms of where we're focusing our intentions in our budget. As an example, under one of those board goals around student achievement, there's a goal around 3rd grade reading. There's a goal about successful completion of algebra. There's a goal around 9th grade on track, which is 6 credits or more, and also around graduation rate. And so understanding those 4 areas are how we make some decisions. As an example, as we were looking at adding staffing coming out of the pandemic, we were thinking about that 3rd grade reading goal and making sure that we had additional, where we could make sure that we had 2 adults in every K-1 classroom in our district. That was an intentional investment, recognizing we were coming out of the pandemic, and we also knew that the board had a goal around 3rd grade reading proficiency. So we're using that information throughout the year as we're making decisions. We looked at those board goals again as we were making decisions about, as the question Josh asked about, or Andrew asked about, as we decided which positions were going to be temporary and which positions were going to be permanent. We were also making decisions related to those board goal areas. Another significant investment we've made is we are the largest provider of mental health services to youth in our county. We have done that through the Student Success Act and building of Medicaid, and that going back to that health and wellness goal that our board established around mental health. So again, that specific investment tied back to those board goal areas, and it was a strategy to help to our students to be have better mental health, and at the same time we're tracking that through a survey called Youth Truth, where we're looking at the responses from our students about how they're feeling, because we want to make sure that if we're making an investment, we're also tracking our successes within that.
And kind of dovetailing off of that, the integrated plan is not part of the budget document, but there's links to it. And there's also a reference where you can get it on the website. So other than just the public engagement sessions that the board had, the administration did a lot of engagement of student groups and other like targeted focal groups. And so there were a lot of like public sessions where anyone could show up. And so that integrated plan application that's on the website and referred to in the budget document really goes into a lot of detail about all of those engagement activities that were undertaken and what we learned from those activities and how those activities then informed that integrated plan. And I do think it's more extensive engagement that process was than maybe it's traditionally been in our district, particularly around not just having public sessions, but like particularly around focal groups and student voice. Lots of student voice was integrated into that process. Yeah.
I would add to the comments that historically, I mean, what you're hearing is not a new practice for the district. I mean, historically, pre-pandemic, this team has been doing listening sessions in the beginning of the budget process. I remember one particular session where we had educators show up, librarians specifically, and really made a case for how they fit into the real world learning goal, and that resulted in a budget allocation increasing FTE for library staffing, which was a real benefit for our kiddos. So this is something that the district's been doing for some time now. It's a point of pride for me because I get to go around the state and share the learning and how this district leverages community engagement in the budget process to really make it meaningful and responsive to the needs of the community.
As somebody who was able to attend one of those goal setting, I will recognize, Vince, that it was something that was very rewarding for me and very informative for me to be able to see that. I am wondering how often you look at programs and then look at those success rates, understanding right now that we're in a little bit of a mess because of COVID, but what is historically the looking at graduation rates, looking at things like that and saying, okay, our goals or programs that we thought were gonna work aren't actually working. Let's go ahead and realign these.
There's a number of ways we do that. And one of the things that I agree with what you just said, that we've been wanting for data as we've been going through the pandemic. This is a school board that is made up primarily of scientists and with research backgrounds. And so there are lots of, there's a high desire to have lots of data to look at and to review. So one of the things that we do is we bring that information to the board. As an example that I gave to Nikki a second ago is about Youth Truth. We were looking at what kind of information can we receive from students about their experience, because there are some aspects to our goals that are more difficult for us to track. Academic outcomes are fairly easy, and we disaggregate that by race. We also look at our students by the languages that they speak, their genders. We look at, break down all of our data to look at how our students are doing. But then there's goals like around real world learning that are harder for us to have a lot of data around, but the things we look at are like students that participate in a CTE course or have a half a credit or a full credit and their graduation rates and outcomes. We look at those kinds of pieces there because again, it gives us some of the information. It doesn't give us all the information because those are harder to unwrap. But we also, our principals develop goals that they establish over the summer, and then they actually come and meet with board members in November and December during work sessions, and they talk about the goals that they've established, how the progress they're making, the strategies that they're employing to try to meet those outcomes in a pretty informal way with board members, and that's I think one of the, but it's powerful, and that there's accountability associated with it. And also in terms of accountability, my evaluation is based on outcomes related to those board goal areas. So that is also a part of the work for me.
So I want to just say exactly what Ryan said, and I want to add to that, recognizing how the school districts and the board looks long-term into investments and acknowledges sometimes you can't put a number on some programs and investments. Great example is the summer school. We don't have any data in the past because we started the summer school program and we believed it will make an impact. And with partnership with the foundation, we were able to invest early enough into the summer school before the state around May said, let's do a summer school last year. So we were able to do it with state funds, and we were able to capture some substantial results, whether it is students getting credits toward their graduation, or I remember them with the teachers with the tie-dye shirts and talking about how it made them feel about being in school and staying in school. I think that speaks volumes of data more than any bell curve that I want to look at. Unfortunately, the state right now, and this is a real example of the state saying, we did not see any results from the summer school. That's why we're not investing in it, end quote. And the reason is, I can't speculate what's the reason. Maybe they looked in they did not look deeper into the idea of a summer school will take multiple summers to come to fruition, or even capturing metrics that we are capturing, like how many credits gets them closer, or even more importantly, that you need to invest before May so school districts across the state can provide good outcomes. So recognizing sometimes even on a state level, the ways of measurement may be fallible, and frankly, I'm making political statements here. It's failing us by defunding summer school after only one attempt. We are really data-oriented, but also we understand where measurements instruments may fall short in a program that takes 13 years to get a functioning citizen or community member to do great things. So just want to highlight that, because as we are keen on data, also we're keen on understanding how long does it take to get outcomes.
I'm assuming you have more questions?
I do, but okay. Let me get myself organized for a minute. Okay, I have a couple of questions, if that's okay, that get a little bit nitty-gritty, if now is a good time, or if we should wait, that's okay too.
I think it's okay.
Okay. One of the things that I noticed that stands out to me most, so just for community members or others who may be looking at the budget document or may go into it, from page 180 on, there are the profiles of each of the different schools, which I really appreciate. And I should have said before I started my questions how beautifully organized this is and easy to understand, that I really appreciate the work that you do to make it so clear for folks in terms of how things are organized and where to find things. So you and team, and the student artwork, that is worth it alone to go through and be able to see the student artwork that's integrated. So just a shout out to those students who share their artwork and make this a beautiful, in combination with a well-organized document. One of the things that was really striking to me in looking at the school profiles is that essentially what we see on each of these pages is that every school, almost every school, is going to be experiencing a reduction in classified staff. And that's 2 to 6, depending on the school. And so I'm just thinking about that in the context of what we were speaking about earlier around teacher support. And I think really appreciate and value the approach of having a dean of students at each of the elementary schools, and also recognizing having more folks in the classroom allows teachers to be able to step out in a moment, be able to go to the bathroom in a long day, or have some of those moments when having, I think I just heard, or just teach, coming out from folks who are here, but to be able to have a little bit of support so that they are not constantly in that fight or flight mode that they have been in for these last few years. So my in-depth budget line questions really just come from that perspective of looking at, are there things that, to your point earlier too, Nikki, is there anything that has been overlooked in terms of what could be moved? You know, one extra person makes a huge difference. 2 extra people makes an even bigger difference. So thank you for humoring me in that. On page 64, I had a couple of questions that I just wanted to ask and get more information about. So in looking at past years, I was just curious about substitutes on lines for 121 and 122. I noticed the substitutes for licensed last year were extremely small with higher in classified, and then I see in this year's proposed budget, there's sort of a flip in what's expected. I'm just curious if anyone can speak to that in terms of expecting more funding needed for licensed versus classified.
The majority of our substitute costs are budgeted in the purchase services section as a 390,
Okay.
because we primarily utilize contracted services for that. And so those numbers you see are really small, probably made up of, oftentimes we have like existing staff that substitute, and so we don't like pay them as an employee and then make them work with our contractor to substitute. And so it probably is just based on like a couple of years of trying to figure out like what that's supposed to look like, and it does fluctuate quite a bit. On occasion, sometimes we might utilize a substitute in a long-term fashion that's not hired through our contractor, but it's not very common.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And that
Yeah.
helps just knowing in terms of that is being
Yeah.
budgeted out in different places. I had a question a little bit further down with 350 with communication, that it looked like there was sort of a pattern in communication and then a huge jump in 22-23 that's expected to continue. And I'm just curious about going from that level of sort of 530 to 800,000, what that might represent or what that might be supporting.
Are you talking about the change from the $700,000 number to a $600,000 number?
No, it's down at 350 under oh, am I seeing the wrong thing? Oh, excuse me, I see what I'm saying. Okay, I'm on the wrong line. Travel. So travel just above that. So going from, I know there was a drop 530, which would make sense, especially in 2020 to 2021, given the pandemic context. And so I'm just curious there around travel. I know that involves professional development, other types of travel. Is that essentially what that is? And just in terms of the large jump being the bounce back from COVID for accessibility?
Yeah, what I see in there is the jump is really in the budgeted years and not the actual years, and I would attribute that to our grant budget. So we always make sure that those, like the special revenue fund and the grants that we like may not know about type of thing, and so I think what you see are larger budget numbers, but the actuals are always smaller than that because we always make sure we want to have enough capacity appropriated so that if we do get a grant or something that we can implement that without having to come to the board to have you modify the budget or something. So my guess is that's what you're seeing.
Okay.
Outside of grants, the travel budgets for like our departments and those were some of the things that we pushed back to departments and asked them to make reductions, particularly like anything that was general fund.
Okay.
But there are a lot of grants that we utilize for those types of things. So we didn't want to impact those at all. I will double check and get back to you, but my assumption is that that's probably mostly budgeted in the grants fund as like a placeholder.
Okay, thank you. I have one more on this page and then one more in general.
And then the communication, the reduction is because we've done staff reduction.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. My final one on this page was under 410, the consumable supplies and materials, and just saw a pretty big jump, it looks like, from 4 million to 6 million there. And I'm just curious about what's entailed in that.
I think I'm going to have the same answer for you for you on that as same with travel, but I'll double check, but my guess is that's primarily in the grant fund. It's kind of a placeholder.
Okay. And then my last question before I pass off to others to be able to jump in. Just went back to page 167, which talks about the allocations of FTE by function. And really, I found this to be a really helpful page too, in being able to see where staffing reductions are happening. You may have answered this earlier, so I just want to double check, because one of the things that was really flagged for me as I was looking through this was the significant number of reductions related to restrictive programs for students with disabilities and less restrictive programs for students with disabilities. And in going through and just sort of calculating the total FTE that was lost, that would mean that 37% of lost FTE directly was impacting students with disabilities.
So
And
function
so you mentioned
1220
that
is
around
where
wings.
the additional year of wings and transitions would have been captured.
Okay.
And so that we hired five educational assistants to work with a group of students who were older than 21 this year. And so the 1220 is attributable to that. You'll see that it like increased and then went back down.
Right.
And that's why. The 1250 is really just a lot of work on developing. I know our Sean Bernard with our Student Growth and Experience Department has done a lot of work on in-depth analysis of the students that we're serving and what their various needs are, and working through like a weighted formula methodology for allocation of staffing. And so I know that there's some like reconciliation in there to make adjustments based on having more data around like what's an appropriate amount of staffing based on different caseloads and caseload needs. And so I think there was a lot of work put into that this year as well. I don't know of any other like standalone type of issue that would have been attributable to that. I would also say that when we're comparing budget, so we're looking at this year's budget and next year's proposed, I also know that, you know, we budget a lot of what we call reserve FTE in that area, because we often have things that happen throughout the year, whether we get a new student or things change. And so when we think about the budgeted numbers and how those generally change into actuals, that's an area where we're always going to have lower actuals than budgeted, because we always hold quite a few positions open. And my guess is that because we were trying to trim up the budget a little bit, I know that we reduced the number of reserve positions we have in our budget for next year compared to what we normally have done. And I believe those two things are the major factors attributing to that change.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Could move some of these specific questions to item 6 so that we can move on to public comment, because we have teachers who have to teach tomorrow.
I was literally about to suggest the
Thank
same thing. So I think, is that something I have to move for, or can I just kind of? Okay, cool. In that case then, I would like to open up for a public comment period. Yeah, that's what I'm reading. So we are now opening the public comment period. Those interested in providing public comment were to register with the committee secretary. Were any such requests received? 2. Okay. Were any to provide testimony virtually? No. Okay. Let's see. And was there any to provide verbal testimony here in person? Okay. The sheriff, there are those interested. Okay, so I guess I read this part. The complete guidelines for public comment are available on the registration table at the back of the gym. Share a few important points. When it's your turn to speak, please come forward and have a seat. State your name and direct your comments to the committee. You will have 3 minutes with which to make your comments. I will alert you when you have 30 seconds left and when your time is up. Following your comments, the committee will have 3 minutes to ask any clarifying questions. Please do keep in mind that the Budget Committee does not set salaries, benefits, staffing levels, or decide if a program, service, or program should be provided. Comments related to district goals, priorities, policies, and programs should be directed to the school board during their next regularly scheduled meeting. Speakers may offer objective criticism of the proposed budget, but the committee will not hear complaints concerning individual district personnel. If you are commenting in regards to a request for an increase or decrease to budget expenditures, note that the budget presented tonight is balanced. It would be helpful if, in addition to any proposed increase, you also identify a corresponding decrease and vice versa. So with that said, who's first?
I have the power all of a sudden. Is it on? Okay. Hi, I'm Jill James. Historically, when I've sat here, I have said that I am a public school teacher in Corvallis. I teach at Bessie Coleman, and also that I am a parent in this school district. I didn't know until Andrew just spoke that there were specific parameters, so if I go outside the parameters of tonight's talk, please let me know and I will assess what I'm going to say. Tonight we're speaking about the budget. I was also hearing talk of engagement sessions, and I will tell you that this is my engagement session. I was never formally invited to an engagement session. I didn't know they existed until I heard them spoken of as far as staff participation in them. And so I have chosen to come to meetings like this in an attempt to engage with people I feel like are making decisions on my behalf and on behalf of my colleagues. As you speak about the budget, I feel like before we talk or I talk about money, I want to talk about the students. Ask an educator. Educators are truth tellers. We're on the front lines. 30 years I've spent in the trenches doing the hard work that I love with the kids every single day. 30 years. When you think about what is needed and wanted for student success, ask me and my fellow educators. From a classroom, every day, with the kids. Before you determine cuts, did you ask me to prioritize what was most impactful in the students that I teach? We are transparent. We have absolutely nothing to hide. Correct me if I'm wrong, student achievement is one of the board goals. Cutting inclusion and instructional assistance, who do you think teaches those children to read by 3rd grade? I teach my whole group. Instructional and inclusion assistants pull small groups of students who are struggling and teach them the necessary skills. So when we talk about cutting the budget, why are we cutting the people that provide the instruction for our students who are most needy of that extra support and instruction? What about behavior support? Our behavior support responds to crises. They respond to children by providing them with support and trauma-informed practices. When I'm busy teaching, it doesn't mean I don't also know behavior support and trauma-informed practices. I use them all day, every day. But it's also important that we have these other adults. The dean seems to be the answer to all of these concerns around behavior support, and I will tell you that one adult added cannot take the place of the 2 that are gone. And I will tell you that the 2 that may be leaving our non-title schools are just as valuable in our schools, because if you look at the behavior data, because we all like data, the behavior data across all elementary schools is very similar. What does that mean? I would thank you. I would say call on us. We are brilliant and passionate, compassionate, aware, knowledgeable. And we can provide the answers to what is needed, despite the fact that we are underrepresented in these conversations, and despite that we are underappreciated, I feel, and underpaid. We actually care more than anybody else in the conversation about kids. I love you guys, thank you.
Does any member of the committee have any questions?
I do, actually. And first of all, thank you for being here. You are exactly who I want to hear from, which is why I was asking, have we asked the educators? But what I haven't heard is, what do you suggest we do in light of the budget situation where we have to cut something? Because I don't know the answer, certainly, of what should get cut when something needs to get cut. I'm with you that I don't want to cut the people that you described, because I think that they're necessary for our students, but I don't know what to cut then. Do you know?
I mean, I think, I can't imagine those decisions are easy for anyone to make. Why would you cut the lowest paid employees? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. We're the people that are the closest to the students. Why would you cut the people that the students are going to miss? Why would you cut the people that they have connections with and are bonded to? The people that support them in small groups, the people that they feel are there. We teach so much about trusted adults. We're talking about cutting their trusted adults. We're talking about cutting their behavior coaches who have been there with them. We heard Joey testify in the last meeting here, or come and speak to the board in the last meeting. I mean, he's a 4th grade student. His mom's here. His anchor is being cut. I mean, these are people that are valuable. So do I have an answer of who to cut? Not those people. And so that's not my job to figure out where the cuts necessarily come from, but I would say the top if I had to choose. It's not my choice, unfortunately.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for your time.
There we go. Okay. Patricia Von Glahn, and I am a former teacher in the New York City public school system. I'm also part of the law enforcement and the prison system with teaching children many years ago. And in Corvallis, I am known as an advocate, particularly for special ed, and with great concentration on reading. So if we want this 3rd grade status to read, we've heard this for 15 years. My son is 28 now, and we're still talking about how to get these kids up to 3rd grade. Adding another person in the room is fabulous. What's the training of that person? What's the methodology? If you like data and you like research, look at the successful, proven methodologies for teaching students. Not this piecemeal curriculum we keep putting together. We have to move so far away from this. And if anyone wants more information, I am happy to give you the name of the 5 leading programs over the last 20 years that produce results. Having the extra body is fabulous. Now let's put them to good use. So in terms of budget, because all the numbers are spinning around in time here, instead of using the word cutting, let's examine. You did a survey of kids. Let's survey our administration. What's the talent within the administration? How is it being used? Can those persons be reallocated to the classroom to help teachers? It is my understanding that a committee has been working on the IB foreign language high school program, bringing different languages in it, and it's my understanding that at least one member of that committee was trained as an assistant principal. How many people are on that committee and other committees like that? It's a great future idea. We are in crisis mode. The ceiling and the floor has fallen out on our teachers, on our students, parents, and community. Okay, reallocate some of these people. I want that assistant principal in a classroom, not this nice goal in 4 years. There are people here we can reallocate. The librarian, we went through this a number of years when I suggested, why are we paying a librarian when we have college-educated, retired professors who would love to come in for free? So I know it's a stickling point, and I know there was some union negotiations, but I'm bringing it up again. I have a librarian friend who's a certified teacher. Put her in a classroom. She can help so many more kids read in that classroom. I want to thank Courtney for looking at other avenues of revenue. I think that's a very important idea. There's other staff that is on what I would call soft money, money and a grant, and I understand is being cut. This is a significant human being, one of the most highly trained teachers. Reallocate this person. You're talking about mental health, reallocate into mental health.
Please
Reallocate into
do
wings.
wrap up your thought. You are already over
Okay.
30 seconds over your time.
Declining enrollment, Courtney, your point is made very well. People in my neighborhood are leaving the school district because of behavior, not because of anything else. My community is moving in with children, wealthy people who can go to private school. Why spend $7,000 at this private school? They'd rather go to the public school, ride the bike right to the public school. So it's the behavior. We got to get a handle on this and look at other places that have been successful. There are right here, right across our border. The consequences have got to be very clear and adhered to. The behavioral standards have to be clear. This is what I keep hearing from parents and teachers. Yes, people have been traumatized by COVID, but there's many, many successful schools in big inner cities that have had trauma their whole lives. And they bring in a very clear program of rewards and consequences with the parents involved, and everybody agrees. It's very clear. It might seem like an old tough love approach, but the families that I'm
Okay,
talking to
I am
leaving,
unfortunately
that's why
going to
you're
have to
leaving.
cut you off. You're 2 minutes over your
That's
time.
okay. I'll save the other 3 pages for another day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your efforts and for being so, so particular with the budget. Let's turn that into finding good staff and keeping them.
Howard, before you leave, though, are there any questions from members of the committee? No. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
All right. Were there any other comments? Okay. Hearing no further comments, public comment is now closed. And I would once again like to thank those that took the time to come and speak today. It is always appreciated. So, let's see, it's 9 o'clock. Do people feel like taking a quick recess for like 5 minutes, or do we want to just keep pushing through with some more questions? Okay, let's keep pushing through. I do have a question myself real quick. Superintendent Nas, you mentioned that the school district is the #1 provider of mental health services in the county for students through billing of Medicaid.
And the access to the Student Success Act.
Okay. Where are those appointments located? Are they located in the schools that the students are actually physically attending, or do they have to go to another place?
No, we've hired our own mental health therapists and skills trainers who work with kids directly at school. We know that kids spend the majority of their waking hours with us over a 9-month period of time, and that's where they're at, and that's where they can best be served, and also to generalize the skills that they're learning. So we have those services at all of our schools at this point in time.
Good, because I was going to make a selfish remark of that if they were having to be transported, the place I work for would be able to provide that transportation at no cost, thus maybe saving the school district some money. But if they're already here in place, then never mind.
Having been a principal and running into situations where transportation was a barrier for kids getting those services, I think wherever we can provide any services we can provide within a school are better accessed by our kids and by our families. So that's a priority for us.
Perfect. Okay. Sammy?
So if this is a good time to ask it, and I think maybe it was touched on with the last question from Shauna, if someone wants to track IDEA funds and also the EDMW funds that are allocated for students with special needs. How can they see it as resources, and how can they see it as requirements? Is there particular pages or fund numbers that they can track?
Did you say IDEA, or were you talking about ADM allocations?
So both, in federal level IDEA and from the state level EDM allocations that are earmarked for students with disabilities, since I think they get 100% extra.
Yeah, so in the budget document, it's just based on the source. So a federal source is identified as a federal revenue source or a state revenue source. And so on the revenue side, it's not distinguishable. And on the expenditure side, it would really be based on the function, probably more so than anything else based on what's included in your budget document. We do need to comply with maintenance of effort at the federal level. And so every year we report our spending to the state at the end of our audit process. And we do use like a special code to identify special education expenditures and just in the general fund, and then that information is captured at the state level. But for the budget purposes, it's that level of detail isn't part of it.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Olivia or Ryan? No, I think it's yours.
Okay, thank you. All right, I just have a couple. One is about College Hill and the alternative pathways. And I know that sometimes that's represented, and when we look into the specific schools or some of the specific FTE allocations, it's not always mentioned. And I know that they are pulled out from their home high schools often. One of the things that I found that I was looking for that I couldn't find represented were things like some of the student needs or student demographic breakdowns, if that's something that can be provided, and then also things like the number of staff and administrators that are designated to College Hill in particular, just so we could see how those were changing over time in the way that we've been able to with the other programs.
In terms of the allocations, you'll see that listed in their staffing allocation breakdown and the discretionary allocation breakdown. But for the SS school level reporting pages, because it's not defined as a school, that data isn't disaggregated that way. It's not that we couldn't do that, but it's not this is correlation to the federal requirements for reporting by school, and so if we did that, it wouldn't match our other information. So I'm not saying it can't be done, but it would all have to be done manually, and we do have some tools that help us do that. Like with things like enrollment, it's easier for us to separate it, but when it comes to some of the achievement data, that would definitely be harder. The spending, we have the ability to control that more. But yeah, to put a page together wouldn't be very comparable, and all of that information is embedded in those other two high schools, so we'd have to pull it out of there as well.
Okay, thank you for explaining
Yeah.
that. And I don't want to put extra load on the work you're doing, but go ahead, Ryan.
So again, sort of big picture, we have continued to have College Hill as a pathway intentionally, because when you look at the graduation outcomes for our two high schools, those include our kids at College Hill. As an example, in Gaps, next door to us, they have a separate high school, an alternative high school that has a separate graduation rate from their two comprehensive high schools. And we don't think that that is the practice we want to employ here, because we want to make sure that all kids are continue to be attached to their home high school, because that's an important factor for us. And as we think about all students achieving, that's the way we've done that in Corvallis historically. What it does do is it sometimes makes the information harder to track because it's embedded, but it's an intentional decision that was made long before I came into this role, and something that we continue to do.
And I'll just note too that I did find some of the information I was looking for on page 168 with the staffing allocation breakdown. That was the one piece that I was really looking for in terms of student to educator or staff member ratio. So thank you for pointing that out. I have one more question on that page. I think I'd probably categorize it more as a concern than a question. In looking at the counseling and social work staff and FTEs designated across programs, and then comparing that with student numbers, one of the things that stood out to me was, sorry, I'll give you a chance to flip there if you want to follow along. So it's page 168. Was related to Franklin. And in just running some quick numbers of looking at there's a 0.6 at each the K to 5 level and a 0.6 at the 6 to 8 level under counseling and social work in terms of designated FTE. And in looking at the other FTEs relative to the number of students, counseling and social work FTE looks like it's around high 170 or so for other programs, which is still pretty high. But we recognize sometimes that's how things are. For Franklin, it's up to 255 students for one FTE for somebody who's a counseling or social work professional. So I just wanted to point that out as feeling like a discrepancy and also an inequity in services and supports. And just curious if there are other ways that might be showing up, spread out across different positions, or if it really is right now an inequity in the way that students are being served.
I don't know that I would say it's an inequity in the way students are being served. I think the need at that school looks a lot different. And so there's two components in that staffing allocation. There's the school counselor. At our elementary schools, at all schools, we have at least a full-time counselor. The position at Franklin is a 0.75 FTE. And for a mental health therapist, I believe that would probably be like the 0.6 FTE, 0.2. So that's, they probably are there 1 day a week. And I don't think we allocated anything this year, and so it's actually a improvement. And what, is that accurate?
That is accurate.
Okay.
We didn't have, we had an intern in the program who was working there. So this upcoming school year, we'll have someone who is there 1 day a week. And the mental health allocation across the district was another one of those opportunities to take a look at who's being served, who needs to be served, numbers, equity, disaggregating data by race. All of those things were taken into account. And our mental health manager, Joe Lycum, made those decisions with his team. So that was one of the questions that we had before from Nikki, like, are the people on the ground part of that? And his team made those decisions about how they were going to staff across buildings.
Okay, any further questions? Okay. So at this point, I think we'll open it up for requests for more information. Since it's already 9 o'clock, I think we should hold off on actually deliberating and passing on until maybe next time. As much as I wanted to get it all done today, I think that would probably be best. That way we can get any requests for information. So I guess, though, I do still have to follow the script. Before we begin committee discussion, does any committee member wish to make any disclosures for the record? Seeing none, we'll open it up for questions and requests for more information. So does any member of the committee have any further questions or requests for information specifically that they want? Cool. All right, moving right along. I was informed that there were no minutes finished for us to adopt tonight, so we will not do any of that. Obviously, if the committee does wish to deliberate and get this done tonight, I'm fine, but if you would rather adjourn, I am open to a motion to adjourn. Ben?
So my question is, it appears that the questions of the committee have been expired. I mean, there are no more questions, and I want to, certainly if there are outstanding questions or if the committee needs additional information, we certainly should defer, but if there are no further questions, then I think moving to action would be appropriate. It's not on the agenda, disregard.
That is true. It is officially on the agenda for the next meeting. So, as I said, then so our next meeting would be Thursday, May 25th at 6:30 p.m. Is that going to be here again? Okay. In this location at Lincoln Elementary School, where we will finish our deliberations and approve the budget, tax rate, and amount. So with that said, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chair, I have a procedural question. What is going to be the protocol for questions that do arise between now and our next meeting? How would staff like to receive questions, and how will answers be disseminated to the committee?
So if there are things that come up for you in the next couple of days, you can probably be best to have Jen Schroeder, like, kind of be the receptor of all the information, and then we'll kind of filter out as needed based on what the questions and requests are. And so if you have questions, or if there's like pieces of information you just want to know about, send those requests to Jen, and then we'll kind of work through those and determine who in the district has that information. And we can bring that on Thursday night. If you have other questions, like, you can always just bring them on Thursday night. Most of the time we have answers to questions, but some, like, if you have like a specific request for information that maybe isn't something that's in the budget document or something like that, ideally, by Monday would be good, just so we have time to work through the process.
Question, so for the sake of having a very clear cutoff timing, when you said a couple of days, we should submit any questions. If we expect answers, we should submit any questions by the end of Thursday evening. Is that a reasonable deadline for us? Oh, sorry, we are Thursday.
Yeah.
Monday?
Yeah, that would be best. I mean, we'll do our best as stuff comes in after the fact, but there may be certain things that we wouldn't, like if something comes up next Thursday and it's just information we don't have, we might run into that. But so anything you think would require like some effort, not just like a basic yes/no question or something.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we can't leave until somebody suggests it.
Mr. Chair, I move the committee adjourn.
Okay, we have a duly made and seconded motion to adjourn. Is there any objection? Hearing none, we are adjourned until Thursday, May 25th at 6:30.